So today we're talking about the fungus among us. I had to throw it in. And fungi are really cool. They're a very diverse group of organisms. So these are just 4 different fungi. This is a lion's mane mushroom. See where it gets its name from its lion's mane look. Then you have a latticed stinkhorn. Why do you think it's called a stinkhorn? It smells really bad. Then you have what is called a bleeding tooth, because it literally looks like a tooth that is bleeding. And then you have a puffball mushroom, which I just think are cool looking because they're big giant balls. So, what are general characteristics shared by all fungi? They are heterotrophic, which means they have to find preformed organic molecules for both carbon and energy. So they cannot make their own food. They rely on other organisms for food. One of the weird things about fungi that make them different from animals is that they have external digestion. So they actually absorb nutrients through their cell walls directly from the source. And to do that, they secrete digestive enzymes into the substrate that they're digesting to take in these complex molecules. So they're in the soil and they secrete enzymes right out of their body to digest organisms to get in that nutrients. They're the main decomposers of plant tissues on our planet, specifically in terrestrial environments, so on land. If it was not for fungi, we would have a buildup of dead plant tissue because cellulose is very hard to digest, but certain fungus can do that. They do not have any locomotion, so they cannot get up and walk around. So they use the process of growth to actually find nutrients. Their cell walls are made of polysaccharides that include chitin. They are highly susceptible to desiccation, which means they're highly susceptible to drying out. So desiccation is just another word for extremely dried out. They exist mainly in a slender form of filaments, which are called hyphae, and you'll see some pictures on the next slide about that. Some are unicellular, like yeasts. So certain fungi can be unicellular, but a lot of them are multicellular, such as mushrooms. Yeah.
So what are the main decomposers of animal tissue?
There's a lot of different ones. So like insects, bacteria, fungi can do it as well. Other animals can eat decaying tissue, like think of vultures. So yeah, so animals have a lot more diversity of what can digest them. So hyphae are one of the defining characteristics of most fungi. Hyphae are highly branched multicellular filaments. So if we look at this cross-section of a mushroom here, all of these filaments are all hyphae. Hyphae only grow from the tips. So hyphae are only going to grow at the tip. They're not, the cells further down the hyphae are done growing. They will not grow anymore. This helps them to maintain this very slender tube-like shape, and it gives them access to new food. So by staying in a slender tube-like shape, you're increasing your surface area compared to your volume, which is really important if you have to digest food outside of your body. So the more surface area that's touching the outside environment, the more likely they are to find nutrients, and the more able they are to digest the nutrients. There's a specific type of hyphae that is typically found underground, which is the mycelium, or mycelia for plural. And it's a mass of connected hyphae, and this hyphae, if we're thinking of like a mushroom, for example, grows through and penetrates the substrate. And this is the part of the fungus, the mycelium, that is absorbing nutrients from the environment. And this extensive surface area that you can even see in this picture of the mushroom helps to increase its surface area. To get nutrients from the tips of the hyphae to the rest of the fungal body, their materials are transferred through bulk flow. So it uses a continuous stream of cytoplasm to move these nutrients. Certain groups of fungi have what is called a septum, and it's a slight division in this cytoplasm that helps with bulk flow. So that is a defining characteristic of some of the phylum of fungi we are going to talk about today, but not all fungi have septa. Not all fungi have a fruiting body, but the fruiting body is something that most people notice when they think of a fungus. So mushrooms are a good example of a fruiting body. This releases the sexually produced spores into the air for dispersal. So when you're eating a mushroom, you're actually eating the reproductive part of the mushroom. So those are its sex organs. Yeah. The substrate, so that's just the surface it's growing on. So usually we're thinking of the soil, but it could be on a tree, it could be in an organism. Yeah, so the substrate's just a general term for what the fungus is growing on or through. Great question. So the mycelium is where most of the fungal body is alive at. It's where it's getting its nutrients. The only time that a fungus will make a fruiting body, and remember, not all fungus do this, but for the ones that do, when they make a mushroom type head, is to produce spores and release their offspring into the environment. So a really cool example of the fungus among us are nicknamed fairy rings. So I don't know if you've ever been walking around and you've seen kind of a circular pattern of mushrooms popping up. This is all one organism right here. Bless you. What happens when you see something like a fairy ring is that fungus started growing in the center of that circle, but it depleted all of the nutrients in the soil. So the mycelium have grown out and expanded, and there's no longer that fungus in this area because there's no nutrients. And as it expands out, it makes a circular pattern. And we only know this happens when those sexually reproducing fruiting bodies come out from below the ground. Yeah. So yeah, now that you can see grass is growing here, so the nutrients have been restored. Initially what would have happened, because this is a very large circle, if it was a smaller circle, that grass would have died. There would have been no nutrients left. But over time, yeah, so that mushroom could grow back towards the center. So this is a picture of what the mycelia look like. So you can see how it's highly branched to increase its surface area, so it's reaching as much of the substrate as possible so that it can get the maximum amount of nutrients. So, fungal reproduction. Fungal reproduction can get really complicated. They can reproduce both asexually and sexually. So most of them can produce offspring in two different ways. In fungi, their natural state, when they are not going through sexual reproduction, just when they're hanging out, their natural state is to have a haploid nucleus. So remember, we're diploid. We have, what does it mean to be diploid? 2 sets of chromosomes. Fungi in their normal state only have 1. They produce spores, which are their reproductive offspring. In a terrestrial environment, they're dispersed by wind, water, or animals. Aquatic fungi have flagella on their spores, so the flagella actually move through the water habitat to a new location. In a very simple way, we're just thinking simplistically, if a fungi is going through asexual reproduction, it just makes spores through mitosis because it's already haploid. It's just making copies of itself. In sexual formation, it gets a little more complicated. It's the opposite of what us diploid organisms have to do. We have to split ourselves for them to join again. These organisms are already haploid, so what they have to do is they have to have a fusion of two hyphae of opposite mating types to produce a diploid zygote. So instead, like how humans have to separate through meiosis their gametes so that they're haploid, since fungi are already haploid, they just need to meet one another in the environment and fuse to form a diploid zygote. And then that diploid zygote goes through meiosis, and then three things happen. The first is called plasmogamy, and that's the fusion of those two hyphaes' cytoplasm. So the hyphae meet each other, and the cytoplasm fuses. But you still have two haploid nuclei in the cell. And when you have those two haploid nuclei sitting in the cell, it is called a heterokaryotic cell. So you can see in this picture, it's from your textbook, there are two nuclei in each cell. Then chirogamy happens, and that is when those two haploid nuclei fuse to become a diploid nuclei. And that's when we have our zygote, and then that zygote goes through meiosis, and those spores that are produced after meiosis are released into the environment. Yeah, Peyton.
I was doing sapling earlier, and I just pulled up the question, and the answer that sapling says, right, it says asexual reproduction occurs when haploid body cells produce haploid spores by meiosis. Didn't you just say diploid body cells produce haploid spores?
So if it's going through sexual reproduction, that zygote will be diploid. If it's going through asexual reproduction, the whole time that those cells are haploid because they're just making copies of themselves.
Okay, but then it has two answers. So then it says sexual reproduction occurs when haploid body cells conjoin with body cells from opposite mating types to produce a cell that divides by meiosis.
Can you take a picture of it and send it to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right, guess what time it is? So we're gonna go through the different major phyla of fungi. Remember, fungi are episticons, just like animals, so we do have some things in common with them. We are very closely related to them. So animals are considered the outgroup to fungi. Mycologists, which are people who study fungus, believe that there may be as many as 5 million fungal species. We are nowhere near close to describing all of them. It's very difficult because most of these live underground, so it's hard to find them. So we have all of our fungi. We have our chytrids, our zygomyces, our glaromyces. We're going to talk about these more when we talk about plants because those organisms have symbiotic relationships with plants. Then we have two groups of phyla, the basidiomycetes and the ascomycetes, and these two groups together make dikarya. And those two groups together, dikarya accounts for about 98% of our known fungal species. And I say known because there could be way more of the other kinds and we just haven't discovered them yet. So the first group that we're going to talk about are the chytrids. And in the chytrids, many of these are single cells with walls of chitin. A defining characteristic is that all of these organisms lack hyphae. They do not have hyphae. and they live in the aquatic environment. So they live in water, and they have flagella on their spores. So these organisms are aquatic fungi. So because their spores have flagella, they're motile. They can swim through aquatic environments to find new substrate. Chytrids can cause some very serious diseases. So some of these infect animals. One of the biggest issues in the world with chytrids are chytrid amphibian fungus. And this chytrid fungus affects some very charismatic amphibians, mostly frogs, that live in tropical places. And this fungus has been spread around the world. For example, this golden frog is a very famous frog living in Central America. It has a very strong cultural tie with the people living in this area. When this frog gets infected with a chytrid fungus, it actually starts to dry out the frog. Because remember, fungi can desiccate really easily. They can dry out. So it's stealing water from the frog. So what the frog does to try to protect itself is its body starts to grow extra skin. Frogs breathe through their skin. So when they build up that extra skin, it ends up being harder and harder for them to breathe, and these frogs end up suffocating to death. Now this graph here, on our y-axis, we have our number of species, and on our x-axis, we have the severity. And this dark blue line is the severity of decline, so less than 20% of these species have declined. So those species, about 65 species of frogs, are okay. It's affecting them, but not that badly. 80 species of frogs have been documented to have a decline in their population from 20 to 90%. 60 species have been recorded to have an over 90% population decline due to being infected with this fungus. About 19 species are presumed extinct because you cannot find them in the wild anymore. And 5 species are 100% extinct, all because of one fungus. So that's an example of a bad parasitic fungus that has been spread around the world and is killing our amphibians. Our next group, our next phylum of fungus, are the zygote fungi, Zygomycota. And what makes these guys different? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, it was on the last
Yeah.
slide. So the asexual and the sexual reproduction, is it like one big circle? Like, do they happen in the same process?
So it's 2 different processes. You do not need to memorize this. Don't memorize the chytrid life cycle. I put this up here just so you could see that their zygotes, their spores have flagella on them. Yeah, don't memorize that. You just need to memorize the general life cycle that was on a few slides ago, like just that general one. Yeah, you do not need to memorize this. You don't need to memorize this life cycle either. Putting it up there just for you to have a visual to see how this fungus works. So Zygomycota, their hyphae do not have septa, so they do not have that partial cell wall dividing their cells. So that's one of their defining characteristics, is that there is no septa. They also do not make multicellular fruiting bodies. Instead, what they do is that they have these sporangiophores that are single-celled, and those bust open and release their spores. So you know zygote fungi because they're the ones that make your bread moldy. So now when you go home, if you see moldy bread, you're going to be like, oh man, we got a zygote fungi in here. Yeah. Asexual reproduction is the most common form of reproduction, and they make spores via their sporangium. So here, these are their sporangium. But they can go through sexual reproduction, and when they do that, it's called a zygosporangium. So they make sporangium, they're zygomycota, so they have zygosporangium when they have sexual reproduction.
So does our mold look like that microscopically?
Yes, microscopically, that's what your mold looks like. Some zygote fungi are really cool. This organism, for example, is actually, will tilt towards light. So it has photoreceptors that make it tilt towards the light. Yeah. So now we're going to talk about the dikaryotic fungi. And remember, there's two groups. There's the basiotomycetes and the ascomycetes. So those are the two groups in a very large monophyletic group of dikaryotic fungi. So first we're going to talk about ascomycota. And these are commonly referred to as sac fungi because their fruiting bodies a lot of times make a little sac. So it looks like a little cup. Sac fungi make up 64% of all known fungi. So it is our most well-described and most prolific group of fungi that we know about today. They are dikaryotic, which means that they have two haploid nuclei. These organisms do not have a multicellular fruiting body. What happens in reproduction, so you're going to need to know the difference between these guys, our sac fungi, and our next group that we're going to talk about. You need to be able to compare and contrast the way that they go through reproduction. So you'll need to know that. So in the ascomycota, you have your hyphae that are absorbing nutrients. Then they go through plasmogamy. So we have our fusion of mating. They're sharing cytoplasm, but the nuclei do not fuse yet. So just cytoplasm fuses. And they produce these special little bulbs where they fuse together. So we can have many nuclei in these little bulbs. They are then break apart and become dikaryotic. So they fuse together, there's many nuclei, and then they break into single cells that have two haploid nuclei. So dikaryotic because they have two. And these hyphae then branch and they form a lot of times this sac-like structure. So we have many dikaryotic cells. And then some dikaryotic cells differentiate to form asci, or singular ascus. And these, think of them as little spores. And they still have two haploid nuclei. Then the nuclei fuse, chirogamy. They go through meiosis. So once they go through meiosis, they make 4 haploid nuclei cells, which break apart, and then each spore is released into the environment, so they produce 8 total spores through sexual reproduction. The Basiodiomycota go through a similar process. These are known as club fungi because they have the typical, we like to think of mushroom shape. So this is where many of our mushrooms are in this group. The thing that's different about these organisms is that they end up only producing 4 spores instead of 8, because when they join, they still have their 2 nuclei per cell, but it's when they go through meiosis, they only produce 4 spores instead of 8 spores. That's one of the biggest differences between the two. And if we're thinking of a mushroom, if we have a cross section, that mushroom head, you've seen, if you've ever looked closely at a mushroom, that part underneath the head that looks kind of like gills, that's where it's releasing the spores. So you can see the cross section here where the 4 spores are being released from. Okay, we're going to skip that clicker question. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about fungal ecology, because fungus is among us. So they have mutualistic associations. So if you like to think of plants, if you're a botany type person, fungi have a special relationship with plants that we'll talk about next week that help plants get nitrogen from the soil, and then the fungus gets food from the plants. They're very important decomposers. They do the most decomposition of wood out of any organism on our planet. They have economic uses. So we use them in fermentation. So you could not have beer if it wasn't for fungi. We also use them for biochemical manufacturing of organic substances such as antibiotics. So penicillin, this is a picture of penicillin, that is actually grown from a fungus. Yep. You take penicillin, fungus. We eat it, right? So we eat, well, at least people who like mushrooms. I like mushrooms. I know not everybody does. But you can eat mushrooms. They're delicious. They're a good source of nutrients. They're also pathogens. So we talked about the chytrid fungus and the amphibians. There's many other fungal pathogens that make humans and other animals sick. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because you have these slides available to you. Lichens are a mutualistic group. It's a fungi, usually an Ascomyces, mixed with a blue-green or a green algae. And you've seen these. There are these things that grow on the trees, but they can be very diverse in how they look. So that's an example of a mutualism where both organisms are benefiting. One that we'll talk about next week is mycorrhizae. So that is the mutualistic relationship of this fungus and this plant. Next are leafcutter ants. So leafcutter ants have these fungal nests, and the ants actually tend the fungus. They make sure that it's clean from bacteria and other pathogens. And then they eat the fungus. That's their food source. Leafcutter ants bring leaves back to the nest for the fungus to eat. Endophytes are fungi that live inside plants. It provides protection to plants. So if you're interested in becoming a veterinarian, there is equine fescue toxicosis, and when a pregnant mare eats a plant that has an endophyte in it, she can get very sick. So that's an example from Vet Med. And if you want to read more about it, I have a link down here to a fact sheet from Cornell. Fungi can occur as parasites and pathogens. So this is a picture of a human lung infection from a fungus. They infect plants. So here is fungal blight on chestnut trees in the United States. We don't have chestnut trees around here anymore because this fungus came from Asia and killed them all. Fungi also can infect insects, and it makes them zombies. The fungus tells them what to do. They crawl up a tree, they bite down into the tree, they die, and then the spores pop out of the head of the insect and are released into the environment. I have a really cool video I want to show you.